This piece was shaped through many careful hours of research and refinement. Every detail was chosen with intention to create an immersive experience while treating these real events with the seriousness and respect they deserve. This channel exists to make sure these stories are not forgotten. The children of Beixada Santista were not taken from dark alleyways or snatched in the dead of night. They were handed over willingly to a man who knew exactly how to make himself feel like safety itself. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we uncover 3 disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the smiling stranger at the water's edge. Douglas Baptista, a.k.a. O Maniaco de São Vicente, the São Vicente Maniac. Now let's begin. There is a specific kind of evil that does not announce itself with shadow or snarl. It arrives wearing a smile, carrying small gifts, speaking softly to mothers who are tired and fathers who are stretched thin. It learns the geography of poverty. The way desperation makes people trust a friendly face. The way children raised in survival mode are hungry for kindness from any direction it comes. Douglas Baptista understood this better than almost any predator in Brazilian criminal history. For over a decade, he moved through the coastal communities of São Paulo's Baixada Santista like a ghost wrapped in warmth. A neighbor, a friend of the family, a man who liked children perhaps a little too much, though no one dared let that thought take shape. 8 children are confirmed dead. 8. The youngest were 5 years old. And the method he used, binding small hands and feet, watching tiny bodies fight the pull of dark water, was not born of sudden rage or mental fracture. It was chosen, deliberate, repeated, savored. This is the story of the man they eventually called the São Vicente Maniac, a title that still draws a sharp silence in the coastal towns where the rivers still remember what they swallowed. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Brazil's southeastern coastline carries a particular beauty that borders on cruelty. The Baixada Santista, a sprawling metropolitan stretch along the state of São Paulo, is a place where the Atlantic crashes against white sand, where mangrove roots curl into brackish water like fingers gripping the earth, and where the smell of salt never fully leaves your clothes. Cities like São Vicente, Praia Grande, and Santos press together along this coastal corridor, dense with working-class neighborhoods where life moves quickly and loudly, and where everyone, at some point, knows everyone else's business. Or so they believe. São Vicente is one of the oldest cities in all of Brazil, founded by Portuguese colonizers in the 16th century. It carries its age in the way old port cities tend to, in the weathered facades of its older buildings, in the particular rhythm of its streets, in the way the community folds inward when danger arrives. By the early 1990s, São Vicente and its neighboring coastal towns were growing rapidly, housing developments pushing inland, poverty concentrated in pockets, infrastructure lagging behind population. Families crowded into small houses. Children played in streets because apartments were too small to contain them. Parents worked long hours. Communities were tight-knit by necessity rather than choice. People depended on their neighbors because there was often no other option. It was into this world that Douglas Baptista moved with purpose. Born in 1962 in the state of São Paulo, Baptista was, by outward appearance, entirely unremarkable. He worked as a truck driver for stretches of his life, a profession that gave him both mobility and a socially accepted reason to disappear for days at a time without arousing suspicion. He was not wealthy. He was not educated beyond the basics. He lived among the same working-class communities where his victims' families struggled, which gave him the most dangerous thing a predator can possess: camouflage. He was not the outsider lurking at the edge of the neighborhood. He was the neighborhood, a face that belonged, a man who understood the rhythms and rituals of the communities he inhabited so completely that he could move within them like water through sand, barely leaving a trace. His method of selecting victims was not random, though it appeared so to those who lived through it. Baptista chose poor children between the ages of 5 and 12. This was not coincidence. Children in this age range are old enough to follow an adult willingly, old enough to understand a simple instruction. Come with me, we are going for a walk, but young enough to be overpowered completely. Poor children, furthermore, live within a different vulnerability than their wealthier counterparts. Their parents are often working multiple jobs. Their supervision is sometimes inconsistent through no fault of love but purely through the impossible arithmetic of keeping a family alive on too little. Their neighborhoods are places where adults rely on each other to watch the children, which means a familiar face carries enormous trust. A man known to the family is not treated with suspicion. He is treated like an extension of the safety net that the community has always been. Baptista exploited this with a calculated patience that is deeply unsettling to consider. He spent time befriending families before he moved against their children. He brought gifts, small things, nothing elaborate. Piece of candy, toy, something that made a mother smile at him, that made a child associate him with sweetness and generosity. He was gentle in his manner. He was not threatening. He learned which children were lonely, which ones were adventurous, which ones would light up at the idea of a walk down to the water or a fishing trip along the riverbank. He filed this information away with a quiet precision that no one around him recognized as predatory behavior, because it wore the exact same clothing as kindness. When the moment arrived, and he chose his moments carefully, never rushing, his approach was simple. He would offer to take a child on a walk. To the river. To the sea. Somewhere near water, always near water, because water was not just his preferred location. It was his preferred instrument. The coastline and interior waterways of Baixada Santista provided Baptista with an almost limitless selection of killing grounds. Rivers cutting through mangrove forests. Tidal inlets accessible only on foot. Stretches of riverbank concealed by vegetation where the sounds of a struggling child would be absorbed entirely by the surrounding wilderness. He knew this terrain with the intimacy of someone who had studied it. Not academically, experientially. He walked it. He observed it. He understood which locations offered the combination of isolation and water depth that his method required. His method. There is no delicate way to describe what Douglas Baptista did to the children he took, and respecting the gravity of these crimes demands that it be stated plainly. Once he had brought his victim to a suitable location, away from witnesses, away from any possibility of intervention, he would bind the child. Hands tied, feet tied. The knots were not improvised or panicked. They held. They held completely. The binding rendered the child incapable of swimming, incapable of treading water, incapable of doing anything except struggling against restraints that did not give. Evidence from recovered bodies suggested that in at least some cases, sexual assault preceded what came next, though the decomposition state of several recovered victims made conclusive forensic determination impossible. In the case of one victim, a 5-year-old girl named Natalie Jennifer Ribeiro, forensic examination confirmed rape. She was 5 years old. After binding his victims, Baptista would place them or throw them into the water, rivers, mangrove waterways, the sea. And then he would watch. He said so himself years later, when pressed by investigators for a motive. He told them he felt pleasure watching the victims struggle as they drowned. Not remorse. Not claimed psychological compulsion offered as mitigation. Pleasure. The word he used was pleasure. He watched children fight the water with bound limbs until they could not fight anymore, and this, to him, was gratifying. This is the psychology of a man without the fraction of a conscience that most people, even most criminals, retain. The first confirmed victim in the record is Luana Elias Inacio, 9 years old, killed on March 21, 1996. Her body was recovered from a river in Praia Grande. She had been bound. She had drowned. Her death was devastating to her family and disturbing to local investigators. But in the absence of leads, in the absence of a suspect presenting himself, the case moved slowly. Poor communities in Brazil's coastal cities did not, at this time, receive the same investigative resources as wealthier areas. This is a painful truth that cannot be avoided when examining Baptista's timeline. He operated in spaces where institutional gaps in protection were real, where families were left to grieve without answers, and where the absence of justice was not extraordinary but familiar and maddening. 1 year and 7 months after Luana's death, on October 29, 1997, Priscilla Elias Inacio, Luana's younger sister, 8 years old, disappeared and was later found dead in an inlet in São Vicente. The same knots, the same water, 2 daughters from one family, taken by the same hands within 2 years of each other. The devastation that descended on the Inacio family during those years is almost impossible to hold in the mind. A mother who had already buried one child, who had lived with the weight of unanswered questions, who had somehow continued to breathe and function and move through the world, and then the incomprehensible repetition of it. The same monster returning to the same wound. That pattern, the audacity of returning, of continuing, of not being caught, defined Baptista's decade of terror. He moved between the coastal communities. He maintained his appearance of normalcy. He drove his truck. He spoke to neighbors. He brought occasional gifts to families he was cultivating. And he killed. Among his other confirmed victims during this period was Vanessa, his own stepdaughter, 12 years old. This detail shatters whatever remaining framing might allow Baptista to be understood even through the distorted logic of a predator selecting strangers as targets. Vanessa lived with him. She was known to him in the most intimate domestic sense. He killed her too. The same method. She was found, as the others were, or she was not found, and her disappearance became one of the shadows Baptista carried for years without anyone fully understanding what it meant. Also among the victims were Sabrina and Leandro, cousins, 10 and 9 years old respectively, who were taken while walking to school together. The image of 2 children leaving a house on a morning that began like any other morning, walking a route they had likely walked dozens of times before, and simply never arriving. It is the specific dread that parents carry in places where danger does not announce itself. They were found in the water. They had been bound. There was also Fabiana Silva dos Santos, 9 years old. Her body was never recovered. That absence, the inability to bury a child, to place flowers on a grave, to have a location in the world where grief can be physically directed, is its own dimension of suffering that Baptista's crimes inflicted on a family that has now lived with it for decades. Through all of this, through the recovered bodies and the reported disappearances and the grief multiplying across the coastal communities, Douglas Baptista remained unidentified as a suspect. He was not on a watch list. He was not under surveillance. He was a neighbor, a known face, a man who worked with trucks and carried himself with the unremarkable ease of someone who has nothing to hide, because he had buried his secrets in the rivers and mangroves of a coastline that had, so far, kept them. He was not careless. He was not erratic. And this is perhaps the most chilling aspect of those early years. Not the crimes themselves, as monstrous as they were, but the absence of error. The discipline of a man who killed children with deliberate method over an 11-year span and managed, for much of that time, to remain completely invisible to the investigation that should have been hunting him. The communities of Baixada Santista were not passive in the face of these losses. Parents began to restrict their children. Families warned each other. The whisper of something wrong moved through neighborhoods the way such whispers always move in places where the authorities have not yet provided an answer, incompletely, with fragments of fear mixed into speculation. Some believed the killer was a stranger passing through. Some believed it might be someone known. Nobody pointed at Douglas Baptista. He remained in plain sight, trusted, present, and entirely safe. For now, because the water, patient as it is, does not hold its secrets forever. December 25, 2003, Christmas Day. In the neighborhoods of São Vicente, the morning broke with the particular tenderness that the holiday carries even in places where money is short. The smell of food being prepared, children waking before the sun has fully climbed, the noise of a neighborhood collectively pausing from its usual urgency. Families in the working-class streets of the city moved through the morning with the small, deliberate joys that people construct when they have learned not to expect the extravagant. Neighbors called to each other across fences. Radios played. The heat of a Brazilian December settled over everything like a second sky. Natalie Jennifer Ribeiro was 5 years old. She had the kind of aliveness that 5-year-olds carry without knowing it. A total, unself-conscious existence in the present moment, every sensation registered fully, every person either safe or not yet encountered. She was someone's entire world. On Christmas morning, she vanished. Najla de Jesus was also 5 years old. She too disappeared on the same day, from the same city, in what should have been the most protected hours of the most domestic holiday of the year. 2 children, same age, same day, same city, both gone. When the disappearances were reported, the community response was immediate and desperate. Families searched, neighbors organized, the police were notified and began their work. But the children were not found that day. Not on December 26th. Not on December 27th. Not on December 28th. For days of silence, for days of a city holding its breath, for days of parents who could not sleep and could not stop moving because to be still felt like surrender. On December 29th, the bodies of Natalie Jennifer Ribeiro and Najla de Jesus were found floating in the Mambu River, near the town of Itanum. Both children had their hands and feet bound. Natalie had been raped. She was 5 years old. The forensic detail is recorded here not for sensation but because it is the truth of what was done to her, and to omit it would be to soften a crime that deserves no softening. The discovery sent a shockwave through Baixada Santista that was different in quality from the grief that had preceded it. Previous victims had been found separated by months or years. The coastal community had grieved each loss, endured the absence of answers, and continued to function without fully connecting the deaths into a single, terrible pattern. But 2 5-year-olds on Christmas Day, bound, drowned, and now recovered from the same river, made the pattern undeniable. A killer was operating among them, deliberately, repeatedly, without consequence. The investigation was reinvigorated with the intensity that high-profile, emotionally resonant cases generate, for good and ill. The good, additional resources, sharper focus, broader witness canvassing. The ill, the pressure to produce a suspect quickly, to give a grieving community an answer, sometimes leads investigators toward a name before the evidence fully supports it. What happened next in the Baptista case is a function of exactly this tension, and it produced one of the most infuriating chapters in a case already dense with failure. Douglas Baptista was arrested in 2004. He was brought in for questioning in connection with the Christmas murders. Under interrogation, Baptista confessed. He told investigators that he had taken Natalie and Najla. He provided details. He described the method, the binding, the water, the struggle he had watched. For a moment, it appeared that 11 years of mounting terror had reached its end point. A confession, an arrest, justice in motion. He was not convicted. The precise legal and procedural mechanisms that led to Baptista's release in 2004, following a confession, are a study in how justice can fracture at the exact moment it appears most secure. Confessions, under Brazilian law, require corroboration. They cannot stand alone as the sole basis for conviction, a protection against coerced admissions that is, in principle, correct and important. But in this case, the corroborating forensic evidence sufficient to satisfy the court standard was not fully assembled in time to prevent Baptista's release. He recanted his confession. Without the confession and without sufficient physical evidence attached to the specific charges before the court, the prosecution could not proceed. He walked free. Let that settle. A man who confessed to drowning 2 5-year-old girls on Christmas Day walked out of custody because the system's evidentiary requirements, combined with his retraction, created a gap through which he passed. The families of Natalie and Najla were left with nothing. Less than nothing. They had briefly held the knowledge of who had killed their children, and then watched that knowledge become legally meaningless. Baptista did not remain in São Vicente after his release. Whether this was calculated movement or simply an opportunistic relocation is not fully clear, but the effect was the same. He disappeared from the geography of the investigation. He moved to Porto Alegre, a major city in Brazil's southern Rio Grande do Sul state, far from the coastal communities of São Paulo where his crimes had accumulated. He built something resembling a new life there, removed from the waterways and neighborhoods where he had operated. He was not on the run in any dramatic sense. He was not in hiding, not using a false identity. He simply moved, as many Brazilians do, and the distance created breathing room that the investigation, already burdened by its failed 2004 prosecution, could not immediately close. But Baptista, whatever his discipline in operational terms, carried his nature with him. In 2013, 9 years after his release, 10 years after the Christmas murders, 21 years after his first confirmed killing, Douglas Baptista was arrested again. This time, the charge was the murder of a woman named Fabiana dos Santos. This Fabiana, an adult, was not a child. Her murder broke the demographic pattern that had defined every previous crime attributed to Baptista. It suggested something shifting in his behavior, an expansion of target, perhaps a desperation, perhaps simply an opportunistic act of violence against a person who presented herself as vulnerable at a moment when he was capable of violence. The details of her murder are not as thoroughly documented in available records as the child murders, but the outcome was clear. He was convicted, sentenced to 18 years at the São Vicente Penitentiary, and sent back to the coast he had left. He served a portion of this sentence. He was then paroled. The decision to release Baptista on parole. A man who had confessed to 8 child murders, who had been arrested twice in connection with serial killing, who a court-appointed psychiatrist would later describe in language that left no ambiguity about his danger, is the kind of institutional failure that defies easy explanation. It is the product of prison overcrowding, of legal processes that cannot always account for what they know to be true but cannot fully prove, of a criminal justice system strained beyond its capacity, operating within structural inequalities that consistently leave the most vulnerable communities least protected. When he was paroled, Baptista moved to Praia Grande, back to the coast, back to the same shoreline where he had drowned children across the previous decade. He was not monitored with the intensity his history demanded. He moved, as he always had, with the ease of a man who knows exactly what he looks like from the outside. He looked like nothing. He looked like a neighbor, but the evidence that had been quietly accumulating over the years, forensic advances, witness recollections revisited, investigative threads that had never been fully abandoned, was beginning to converge. The case against him for the Christmas murders of Natalie and Nagila was being rebuilt piece by piece, with the kind of meticulous patience that the original 2004 prosecution had lacked. Brazilian authorities were, a decade after his initial confession and release, preparing to move again. And on December 8, 2015, they did. The morning of December 8, 2015 in Praia Grande began the way mornings in coastal São Paulo state generally do, with the ambient noise of a dense working-class city pressing itself awake, the sound of the Atlantic present beneath everything, the summer heat building early. In a residential neighborhood, a man in his 50s moved through the beginning of his day, unaware that the geography of his freedom was about to close around him permanently. Police vehicles arrived at Douglas Baptista's home. Accounts from officers present at the arrest described the moment they came into view as the point at which Baptista's composure fractured. He saw the police cars approaching. He moved immediately and instinctively, not toward the door to admit them but away, attempting to flee. Whether he fled on foot or by another means, the details are less important than the reflexive decision itself. A man who had spent years presenting the face of innocence chose, at the moment of reckoning, not to hold that pose. His legs understood what his expression had denied for decades. He ran. He was cut off. Officers moved to intercept him before he could clear the property. He was apprehended without reported violence, which is, in its own way, a telling detail. The man who had watched children drown with his hands responsible for their binding did not resist physically when the restraints were placed on his own wrists. Whatever calculus governs a man like Douglas Baptista, whatever combination of cold self-preservation and complete indifference to human suffering organized his behavior, it apparently did not extend to fighting armed officers. He was taken into custody for the final time. At the police station, his initial posture was one investigators had seen before. Denial, performed confusion, the claim of innocence wrapped in the assertion that he had no idea why he was being sought. He told officers he had not known police were looking for him. He told them they had the wrong man. He sat in the position of the wrongly accused and worked it for as long as it held. It did not hold long. The investigators working the Christmas murders case had spent years building a structure of evidence that did not depend solely on Baptista's confession. Forensic connections, witness accounts that placed him in proximity to the victims, the physical reality of the knots, a distinctive binding pattern that linked multiple recovered bodies across different locations and different years. The totality of what had been assembled was, this time, substantially more than what the 2004 prosecution had possessed. Baptista was confronted with what existed. The performance of innocence began to crack. And then, in a shift that investigators described as unexpected in its completeness, Douglas Baptista confessed again. Not just to the Christmas murders, not just to the crimes he was currently being charged with. He confessed to everything. He told officers about children they had not yet connected to him. He revealed the fates of victims whose disappearances had been unsolved. He told them about Luana and Priscilla, the two sisters, the daughters of the Inacio family, confirming what investigators had long suspected but could not legally establish. He talked about Sabrina and Leandro, the school-bound cousins who had walked into a morning that never delivered them to their classroom. He talked about Vanessa, his stepdaughter, 12 years old, whose death had been absorbed into the statistics of missing persons without a name attached to the cause. He also, and perhaps most chillingly, revealed where some of the bodies were. He led authorities to disposal sites. He described, with a geographic precision that suggested careful memory rather than vague recollection, the locations where he had placed victims after drowning them. Some of these locations were in waterways that had been searched before and yielded nothing. The bodies moved by current, by tide, by the relentless motion of water that does not respect human need for closure. Others provided the physical remains that families had been waiting years to find. This process, a killer walking investigators through the geography of his crimes, pointing to rivers and inlets as though narrating a route on a map, is one of the most disturbing images in the entire case. Not because it was unique in the annals of criminal investigation, but because of what it revealed about the internal landscape of Douglas Baptista. He remembered where he had been, what he had done, and where he had left each child. This is not the memory of a man who acted in psychological frenzy and retained only fragments. This is the memory of a man who experienced these acts as significant, as memorable, as stored in a way that mattered to him. He kept his crimes in his mind the way other men keep milestones. When investigators, in the days following his arrest, pressed Baptista to explain himself, to provide whatever motivation or psychological architecture might account for what he had done, he gave an answer that has since become one of the most quoted statements in Brazilian true crime coverage of the case. He said he felt pleasure watching the victims struggle as they drowned. He said he was possessed by a strange force. The second claim, the strange force, was almost certainly a calculated mitigation attempt, a gesture toward the possibility of diminished responsibility, a door left slightly open through which his legal situation might be navigated. Brazilian courts, like courts in many countries, treat claims of psychological compulsion as potential mitigating factors, and Baptista was not without legal representation. But the first statement, the pleasure, was something else entirely. It was not the language of someone reaching for diminished responsibility. It was the language of someone answering honestly, momentarily, before the protective narrative reasserted itself. He felt pleasure watching children drown. He said so. And the investigators who heard him say it, according to accounts from people close to the case, received the statement in the specific, heavy silence that surrounds the moments when a case stops being an abstraction and becomes the full reality of what one human being chose to do to others. Before his trial formally commenced, Baptista was examined by Guido Palomba, one of Brazil's most prominent forensic psychiatrists, a man with decades of experience evaluating individuals accused of crimes that exist at the outer limits of human behavior. Palomba's conclusion was unambiguous. He described Baptista as abnormal and, in language that was unusual in its directness even for forensic psychiatric evaluation, declared him absolutely unrecoverable. This was not the language of a doctor hedging toward uncertainty. This was a clinical assessment that carried the weight of professional conviction. The man before him could not be rehabilitated, could not be treated back toward something resembling safety, could not be released into any community and expected to pose anything other than continued lethal danger. The trial that followed moved with the efficiency that the assembled evidence permitted. Baptista was tried for the murders of Natalie Jennifer Ribeiro and Najla de Jesus, the Christmas victims whose deaths had first cracked the case open in 2003 and whose failed 2004 prosecution had allowed Baptista 12 additional years of freedom. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. It was not the end of the legal proceedings. 2 years after the first conviction, in August 2017, Douglas Baptista was brought back before the court for the murder of Priscilla Elias Inacio, the 8-year-old younger sister of Luana, killed in 1997, 18 years before Baptista's final arrest. A second 30-year sentence was handed down. Combined with his earlier 18-year conviction for the murder of Fabiana dos Santos, Baptista's total imprisonment reached 60 years, a number that, while technically finite, functions in practical terms as a sentence for the remainder of his natural life. He was placed in solitary confinement, separated from the general prison population. This was not disciplinary. It was protective of Baptista himself, because prison populations have their own moral hierarchies. And at the very bottom of every hierarchy that exists within Brazilian incarceration is the individual who killed children. Repeatedly. Without remorse. Other prisoners, whatever they themselves had done to arrive at their sentences, would not have allowed Baptista to exist among them. He remains isolated. He remains alive. The families of his victims remain with the permanent weight of what he took from them, a weight that no sentence, no legal proceeding, no confession fully lifts. Justice, when it finally arrives after a long delay, arrives wearing different clothes than the justice that comes quickly. It is not clean. It does not restore. It carries within it the shadow of all the years it did not exist, all the time during which the killer continued and the victims accumulated and the families bore their grief without even the cold comfort of a name to attach to their losses. The justice that arrived for Douglas Baptista in 2015 was real. His imprisonment is real. His isolation from society is permanent in all practical terms. But it arrived 12 years after the Christmas murders of 2003. It arrived 19 years after the killing of Luana Inacio, the first confirmed victim in the documented timeline. For the families of the children he drowned and bound and left in the waterways of Baixada Santista, the reckoning came accompanied by a lifetime of damage that could not be undone. Begin with what was lost and never fully recovered. Fabiana Silva dos Santos, 9 years old, whose body was never found. There is no grave for Fabiana. There is no physical location where the people who loved her can go to perform the rituals of grief that human beings have used since the beginning of memory to make bearable what is not fully bearable. Baptista knew where he left her. When he led investigators through his confession, Fabiana's fate was among the disclosures. But the search for her physical remains, conducted in waterways and locations he identified, did not produce her. Water is a thief of evidence. Tides shift sediment. Years transform everything. Fabiana's family received, at best, a partial answer. The name of the man who killed their child, the general geography of her death, and the continuing absence of her physical remains. They buried a name, not a body. For the Inacio family, the mother and father who lost 2 daughters, Luana in 1996 and Priscilla in 1997, to the same killer's hands. The years between those deaths and Baptista's final 2015 arrest represent a span of time that defies ordinary comprehension. 18 years. 18 years of knowing something was wrong, of understanding that their daughters' deaths were connected, of living with the specific torture of unsolved grief. When Baptista confessed in 2015 and named both Luana and Priscilla, when he confirmed what investigators had long suspected, the Inacio family received confirmation of a truth they had perhaps already known in the way that grief sometimes knows before proof arrives. It was not relief, could not have been relief. It was the completion of a horror that had begun in 1996 and run, uninterrupted, through nearly 2 decades of their lives. The forensic psychiatrist Guido Palomba's assessment. Absolutely unrecoverable. became the phrase most associated with Baptista in Brazilian true crime and media coverage of the case. It is a phrase worth examining not just for what it says about one individual but for what it implies about the nature of certain kinds of violence. Palombo was not offering this assessment in the context of a debate about rehabilitation or the purpose of incarceration. He was making a statement of clinical fact as he understood it. This man's psychological architecture is not something that treatment can address or alter in any meaningful way. The pleasure Baptista expressed in watching his victims die, the stated, explicit pleasure, offered in his own words, was not a symptom that medication could quiet or therapy could redirect. It was structural. It was him. Brazilian criminology and the criminal justice community engaged seriously with the Baptista case in the aftermath of his final conviction, and one of the concrete legislative responses it provoked was a proposal to formally define and categorize serial murder under Brazilian law. Prior to this proposal, Brazilian criminal code lacked a specific legal category for serial killing. Crimes were charged individually, which meant that the full pattern of a serial killer's behavior was not formally recognized as a distinct and elevated category of criminal conduct warranting its own sentencing parameters. The Baptista case made the absence of this categorization feel untenable. The proposal that emerged was substantive. Define serial murder as the commission of at least 3 crimes sharing the same modus operandi, and establish a mandatory 30-year sentence without parole eligibility for individuals convicted under this category. It was, in other words, a direct legislative response to the specific mechanisms by which Baptista had been able to operate for so long and be released after his 2004 arrest. The absence of a legal framework that could hold the totality of his conduct rather than individual charges in isolation. The proposal was eventually shelved. It did not become law. This outcome, the failure of a reform directly inspired by one of Brazil's most extensively documented child serial murder cases, is not a small footnote. It speaks to the persistent difficulty of translating the lessons of catastrophic failures in criminal justice into durable structural change. The political will generated by a high-profile case tends to be finite, subject to the pressures and competing priorities of legislative calendars and public attention spans. The families of the children Baptista drowned deserved not just the imprisonment of the man who killed their children but also the institutional changes that would make it harder for the next Douglas Baptista to move through communities undetected, to be arrested and released, to accumulate victims across years because the system did not possess the tools to recognize and respond to what it was seeing. They did not receive those changes. Baptista's crimes were later featured on the Brazilian crime program Investigação Criminal, which brought the case to a national audience that extended well beyond the communities of Baixada Santista where the victims had lived and died. The response was, as such coverage typically generates, a combination of horror and the particular retrospective reconsideration that follows when an audience learns that a man who killed children for over a decade looked and acted, to everyone around him, like a completely ordinary person. The reflex question, "How did no one know?" is perhaps the most human response to cases like Baptista's, and also one of the most important to resist accepting at face value. People often do not know because killers like Baptista are not, in fact, legible in the way the mythology of predators suggests. True crime as a genre, and this case exists within that tradition, carries the risk of retrospective clarity. The tendency to look backward at a killer's biography and construct a narrative in which the signs were present all along, in which the careful observer should have recognized the danger. The gift-giving, the friendly rapport with adults, the ease with which he positioned himself as a benign presence in their lives, these were not sloppy camouflage. They were sophisticated social engineering, executed by someone who had understood, at some level, that his predatory intent required sustained concealment, and who had developed the capacity to maintain that concealment across years and across multiple communities. The communities of Baixada Santista themselves were not passive bystanders to a legible threat they failed to see. They were the targets of a calculated deception by a man who chose them precisely because their social structures, the interdependence, the trust networks, the reliance on familiar faces, could be weaponized against them. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of Baptista's specific methodology. He did not attack communities from outside. He attacked them from within, using the very architecture of their mutual care as the mechanism of access to his victims. For the children who survived, who knew Baptista, who had perhaps spent time in his company, who had walked with him toward water and returned safely because on that particular occasion something intervened or he chose not to act. The aftermath of his exposure carries its own complicated weight. They grew up in a region where the man they had known as a neighborhood figure was eventually confirmed as someone who had murdered their contemporaries in the most methodical and brutal manner imaginable. The texture of memory shifts when something like that is introduced into it. Ordinary recollections of childhood geography, the river, the mangrove paths, the coastal inlets, become overlaid with a knowledge that cannot be unlearned. The waterways of Baiksada Santista are unchanged in their physical character. The Mambu River still moves toward the sea near Itanum. The inlets of São Vicente still collect tidal water at the same predictable rhythms. The mangrove forests that line the coastal wetlands of Praia Grande still offer the same dense silence that Baptista exploited across 11 years. Geography does not mourn, continues. But the people who live alongside it, who raised their children on its shores, who lost those children to its depths because a man with bound hands and cold patience stood watching. They carry what happened there in a way that cannot be put down. Douglas Baptista, as of the writing of this story, remains imprisoned. His 60-year cumulative sentence, combined with his age, ensures with near certainty that he will never be released. He sits in isolation, separated from other inmates by both physical infrastructure and the prison population's own moral rejection of what he represents. He is alive. He breathes. He eats. He exists in a way that the children he drowned, Luana, Priscilla, Vanessa, Fabiana, Sabrina, Leandro, Natalie, Nagila, no longer do. The youngest of his confirmed victims were 5 years old. He said he felt pleasure watching them drown. The word he used was pleasure. And somewhere in Baiksada Santista, on certain evenings when the Atlantic wind moves through the mangroves in a particular way and the rivers reflect a particular quality of fading light, the families who know what those waterways contain still find themselves looking at the water for longer than they intend. Not searching anymore, just remembering, because the children do not come back, and the water does not answer. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Guarulhos Maniac. He wore glasses he didn't need, so he could look smarter than you while he planned your death. AKA, O Maniaco de Guarulhos, the Night Stalker of São Paulo streets. Somewhere in Brazil, a teenage boy watched his mother survive 2 bullets and walked away from that scene not relieved, not traumatized, but furious that she was still breathing. He was 19 years old, barely old enough to be tried as an adult, and he had already mapped out the death of his 19th victim in his mind before the police ever put a hand on him. When they dragged him in off the street, high, hollow-eyed, reeking of the night, he didn't crumble, didn't weep, didn't beg. He sat down, and with a calm that made the investigator's skin go cold, he began talking. He told them about 50 women. 50. Not 1 or 2, 50. He described methods. He described locations. He described what he did after the breathing stopped. Details so grotesque that seasoned detectives had to leave the room. He spoke as if recounting errands. As if death was simply something he ran on weekends. The city of Guarulhos, São Paulo, had already been living under a shadow for over a year. Women disappearing from dimly lit roads, bodies turning up in alleys and behind trailers and in stadium parking lots, all strangled, all violated. And when they finally found the man behind the mask, he was not some monstrous figure with wild eyes and a scarred face. He was a thin young man wearing glasses he did not need. Glasses he wore purely to appear more intelligent, more composed, more above those around him. That detail, small as it seems, tells you everything. This was a predator who thought about presentation, who curated how he was perceived, who hunted with calculation, not impulse. This is the story of Leandro Basilio Rodriguez, the boy who decided at 13 that the world owed him death, and spent the next 6 years collecting it, one woman at a time. To understand what Leandro Basilio Rodriguez became, you have to stand in the house where he grew up, and feel the rot inside its walls long before a single crime was ever committed. Guarulhos sits just northeast of Sao Paulo, a city of nearly 1.4 million people pressed up against the edges of Brazil's largest metropolis. It is a city of contradictions, enormous in population, yet often invisible in the national conversation. Home to Sao Paulo's international airport, yet defined more by its labyrinthine working-class neighborhoods than by any glamour associated with that geographic distinction. It is a place where people hustle, where families crowd into small homes on narrow streets, where the noise of a city that never sleeps bleeds into every corner of private life. It is the kind of place that forges resilience in most of its children, and in rare, terrible cases, forges something else entirely. Leandro was born in 1989 into a household that offered him neither safety nor consistency. His father was an alcoholic, the kind of man whose relationship with the bottle was the most committed one in the home. His mother was unfaithful, repeatedly, brazenly, and Leandro grew up watching that infidelity play out in the cramped, unavoidable intimacy of a small house. What children absorb from such environments is complicated. Some learn to shut down. Some learn to escape into themselves. Some develop a burning shame that turns, with time, into something far more corrosive. For Leandro, what grew inside him was resentment. A slow, poisonous accumulation of rage directed specifically at his mother's behavior, at women, at the concept of desire itself as something that could humiliate and betray and destroy. And then came the night that shattered whatever fragile structure remained. He was 13 years old when he witnessed his mother being shot. Not once, but twice. By a boyfriend. 2 bullets. She survived. And here is where the story of Leandro Basilio Rodriguez becomes something uniquely, disturbingly dark. He was not relieved. He was disappointed, standing there, watching the woman who had shaped his warped understanding of femininity survive what should have ended her. Something inside him made a decision. A vow. Not a grief-stricken boy's cry into the void, but a cold, deliberate internal promise that he would become a killer. That if the world would not finish what it started, he would take that responsibility upon himself. Experts who later examined his psychology described a textbook portrait of compounding trauma transformed into sociopathic ideology. He did not grieve. He did not seek help. He did not find a path out of the wreckage of his upbringing. Instead, he adopted the wreckage as his identity. By the time he was in his early teens, Leandro was already deep in street crime, running with others, committing robberies and assaults alongside a 14-year-old girl who would eventually bear his child. That relationship, brief and chaotic, was perhaps the last human connection he would allow himself. And when she left him, exhausted by his criminal spiral, exhausted by who he was, the final thread snapped. She walked away, and in doing so, she became, in his fractured perception, just another woman who had abandoned him. Another confirmation of everything he believed. Another reason. What followed that abandonment was not a slow unraveling. It was an acceleration. Leandro did not hesitate at the threshold of violence. He crossed it with the casual ease of someone who had been rehearsing the crossing for years. He later told investigators that he had begun killing while still underage, starting in Belo Horizonte, the sprawling capital of the neighboring state of Minas Gerais. He described his first victim, a woman he remembered as tall, blonde, slender, around 25, a crack user like himself. He killed her and disposed of the evidence with a thoroughness that suggested he had already thought about this moment in great detail. He shot her twice, hid the body, and set it on fire. Then he came home. He said he never went a long stretch without killing again. Nunca mais fiquei grande periodo sem matar. I never again went a long period without killing. That sentence, spoken to investigators with no detectable emotion, became one of the most chilling statements attributed to any Brazilian criminal of his generation. Because it was not a boast. It was not theater. It was a simple, almost administrative account of how his life worked. From Belo Horizonte, the trail moved. He passed through Rio de Janeiro, where investigators later believed he claimed additional victims, women, all of them, disposed of with the same methodology. Then he returned to Sao Paulo, then back to Guarulhos. He was a man in perpetual motion, a predator who used geography the way other criminals use disguise, staying ahead of patterns, never long enough in one place for anyone to connect the dots. By the time he was operating openly in Guarulhos in 2007, he was 18 years old and had already, by his own account, ended more lives than the police would ever be able to confirm. His method was not spontaneous. It was a practiced choreography. He drove. That detail matters. In a city where most young men his age moved on foot or by public transit, Leandro had access to a vehicle, which gave him a range and a reach that pedestrian predators lack. He would move through the neighborhoods at night, watching. He targeted women who were alone. He targeted those who appeared vulnerable, women involved in drug use, women walking isolated stretches of road, women whose circumstances made them less likely to be immediately missed, or whose absence might initially be attributed to other factors. But later, as the crimes progressed, his targeting expanded. He would go after women who were simply in the wrong place, simply alone, simply female. He offered drugs. That was the lure, a casual, conversational offer in a world where substances were currency and connection. He pulled up, spoke the language of the streets, and made the offer. Women who accepted were driven somewhere quiet, somewhere dark, somewhere that the rest of the city could not hear. There he would attack. He used a chokehold described by investigators as resembling the Mata-Leão, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu rear-naked choke, a technique designed to cut off oxygen and blood flow to the brain simultaneously, producing unconsciousness rapidly and death shortly after if held. He was physically powerful. Prosecutors would later note that his victims were universally described as slight, small, thin women, and that this was not coincidence. He selected those whose size minimized the risk of resistance. He was strategic about his own safety even as he obliterated theirs. And after the life left them, Leandro did not flee. He stayed. What he did to the bodies of his victims is documented in court records and autopsy findings that prosecutors used in their case. Acts of post-mortem violation that transformed these crimes from brutal murders into something that occupied a category of depravity that even hardened investigators found difficult to process. He treated the dead with a contempt so total, so consuming, that it obliterated any remaining doubt about what drove him. This was not passion crime. This was not rage in the moment. This was systematic desecration, the expression of a hatred so deeply embedded in his psychology that it outlasted the act of killing itself. He left the bodies where they fell, in alleys, behind trailers, in parking lots, on roads. He had no interest in concealing them for long. Concealment was not part of his calculus. He was not afraid of being caught because, for a long time, no one was looking for a single person. The crimes were scattered. The victims were different women from different neighborhoods, found at different intervals. The pattern was there, but patterns require someone to look at all the pieces at once, and in the early days no one was. Meanwhile, Leandro Basilio Rodriguez went home, put on his unnecessary glasses, and waited for night to come again. There is something particularly unnerving about the glasses, that small, deliberate prop. Criminal psychologists who assessed him described a man with a profound need to project superiority, to perform intelligence, to ensure that those around him perceived him as someone of depth and discernment. He wore them even when confronted with evidence he could not deny. When shown photographs of victims, of crime scenes, of DNA evidence tying him to bodies, he responded with practiced calm. "I don't know," he said. "Not that wasn't me." Not anger, not deflection with emotion. Just cold, flat denial dressed in the quiet confidence of a man who believed, even in custody, that he was the smartest person in the room. He was not, but he believed he was. And that belief had sustained him through years of murder without capture. It had made him bold. It had made him escalate, and it would, eventually, be part of what made him careless. Because in late August of 2008, a police officer recognized a face from a composite sketch on a street in Guarulhos. The face belonged to a young man wandering in the small hours, dazed on drugs, barely coherent. The officer approached, made the connection, made the arrest, and Leandro Basilio Rodriguez, 19 years old, the Guarulhos maniac, the man who had been stalking and killing women across Brazil since before he was legally an adult, was put in the back of a police vehicle for the first time. He arrived at the station still under the influence, and when the drugs wore down enough for him to speak, he opened his mouth and began, calmly, to describe 50 murders. The room went still. September 7th, 2007, Brazilian Independence Day. A date that carries flags and parades and the sound of patriotic music across the country. In Jardim Adriana, a neighborhood in Guarulhos, it carries something else now. Carries the name Kilian Leite da Silva. She was 23 years old, a mother of 2 children, pregnant at the time of her death. She used drugs, a detail that would be noted clinically in the reports and used, sometimes unfairly, to frame her vulnerability as a kind of complicity in what happened to her. But Kilian was a woman, a mother, a daughter, and she was someone's entire world. On that Independence Day, she crossed paths with Leandro Basilio Rodriguez, and she did not survive the encounter. She was beaten, then strangled, then violated after death. Her body was found in Jardim Adriana. Her family, who had been searching for the pregnant young woman who had gone missing, received the kind of news that alters the architecture of a family permanently. The kind of news that does not soften with time, it just changes shape. Investigators noted the cause of death: asphyxiation. They noted the signs of sexual assault. They opened a file. And because there was no immediate suspect, no witness, no surveillance footage that placed a name at the scene, the case moved into the system the way so many cases do. Documented, catalogued, and quietly terrifying in its lack of resolution. 23 days later, the city of Guarulhos met its second body. Vivian da Silva Correa was found on September 30th, 2007, less than a month after Kilian. Her body was discovered in an alley in the neighborhood of Vila Rio. Strangled, violated, left in the dark passage between buildings the way a thing of no value is discarded. The cause of death was the same. The manner of the sexual assault was the same. The positioning, the injuries consistent with a specific chokehold technique. All of it echoed the September 7th murder with an exactness that should have screamed same perpetrator to any investigator laying the 2 files side by side. But investigations take time. Resources are spread thin. And in a city the size of Guarulhos, 2 dead women, both connected to drug use, both found in low-visibility neighborhoods, did not initially generate the kind of investigative pressure that would have made a pattern undeniable sooner. Each case was examined in relative isolation. Each file stood alone. Leandro, meanwhile, had already moved on. His whereabouts during the months between October 2007 and May 2008 are not fully mapped by official records. A gap that haunts the case to this day, because in that time, investigators believe he may have continued killing. He spoke of murders in Rio de Janeiro. He spoke of deaths that extended his confirmed body count into numbers no court could fully substantiate. The cities blurred in his account, the women blurred, the methods remained constant. He was traveling with the ease of someone who understood that movement was camouflage. Then came May 2008. Juliana Teixeira do Nascimento was a student. Young, slender, quiet, exactly the physical profile Leandro consistently selected, which prosecutors noted was deliberate and clinical in its calculation. He preferred women who were small because small women could not fight back with the kind of force that might leave marks on him, might attract attention, might create complications. He was, in every sense of the word, a coward with a method, brave enough to kill the defenseless, careful enough to minimize his own risk at every turn. Between the nights of May 29th and 30th, 2008, Juliana was found dead inside a trailer parked near the Rodovia Elio Smit, a highway that connects Guarulhos to the broader metropolitan area. The location was chosen, investigators concluded, specifically because of its isolation. A trailer near a highway at night is invisible to the world. No one passing at speed looks sideways. No one stops to investigate shadows. She had been strangled. She had been violated. She had been left in that trailer like a secret, and had remained one for some time, because this crime was not immediately connected to the September murders. The geographic distance, the setting, the time elapsed between killings, all of it worked in Leandro's favor. 3 dead women, 3 separate crime reports, no single thread visibly connecting them to one hand. But there were survivors. This is the part of the story that the case files do not shout loudly enough. The women who encountered Leandro Basilio Rodriguez and survived. Women who escaped the car, who fought through the initial attack, who managed to flee into the night or scream loud enough to attract attention before he could finish what he had started. These women went to the police. They gave descriptions. They sat with composite sketch artists and tried to translate the face of their nightmare into something reproducible, something that could be circulated, something that could turn a shadow into a manhunt. A sketch began appearing. A young man, lean, reportedly wearing glasses. The sketch circulated through guarulhos, posted in police stations and circulated among officers on patrol. It was not yet enough to find him. Not without a name, not without a confirmed location, not without the kind of specific intelligence that transforms a drawing into an arrest. But it was the beginning of the net closing. Leandro apparently noticed none of it, or noticed and did not care. Either interpretation is terrifying, but the latter is more consistent with what we know of his psychology. The contemptuous certainty that he was untouchable, that the police were slower than him, that his intelligence placed him perpetually 2 steps ahead of consequence. On August 26, 2008, he killed Aline Sena de Rocha. Her body was found that same day, with the marks of strangulation clear and undeniable, the evidence of post-mortem assault documented by forensic examiners. And then, days later, Giselle Cabral de Souza, suffocated in the parking lot of a sports stadium. Killed in a public space adjacent to a venue that on match days would have been crowded with thousands of people, but in the off hours was simply a vast, shadowed expanse of asphalt where a woman could be murdered and the city would not notice until morning. Giselle was the last confirmed victim of the main Guarulhos killing spree. Not because Leandro stopped wanting to kill. By his own later admission, he had already planned who the next woman would be, had identified a 19th target in his mind, was prepared to continue indefinitely. He stopped because of a moment of sheer, almost absurd chance that had nothing to do with the vast investigative machinery grinding along behind him. On the night of August 27, 2008, one day after Aileen's body was discovered, while Giselle's death was still raw in the case files, a police officer was on patrol in a Guarulhos neighborhood. He saw a man walking the streets in the early hours, visibly intoxicated on drugs, moving through the dark like a man with nowhere to be and no fear of being seen. The officer looked at the face again, reached for the composite sketch that had been circulating for months among local law enforcement. The jawline, the build, the eyes. He made the stop. He made the arrest. And the man in handcuffs, 19 years old, glassy-eyed, barely coherent, was Leandro Basilio Rodriguez. At the station, as coherence returned with each hour away from whatever he had consumed that night, Leandro began to talk. Not because he was broken, not because he was remorseful. The testimony he gave in those early hours of custody had the quality of someone who had been keeping a tally and was finally, almost relievedly, showing someone else the numbers. 50 women, he said. He had killed 50 women. The investigators in that room understood, in real time, that they were either sitting with the most prolific serial killer in Brazilian history, or with a man so steeped in grandiosity that he had inflated his kill count into mythology. Both possibilities were deeply unsettling, because if 50 was the true number, Guarulhos had a catastrophe on its hands that stretched far beyond a string of murders. And if it was a performance, it meant that this 19-year-old felt so secure in his crimes, so confident in his superiority, that he was embellishing his own record with casual pride. He gave details. He described methods across different cities. He named neighborhoods in Belo Horizonte, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo. He described specific physical characteristics of victims he claimed to remember, the height, the hair color, the age he estimated them to be. He was not screaming. He was not pacing. He sat with a stillness that made the room feel smaller, and he talked, and the investigators wrote it down and tried not to let their faces show what their bodies were feeling. By morning, the Guarulhos maniac was in custody. But the city would not sleep easily, because the question that hung over every investigator, every prosecutor, every family who had a missing woman in their history, was not whether Leandro had killed. The question was how many. There is a particular kind of interview that takes place when law enforcement sits across a table from someone like Leandro Basilio Rodriguez, not an interrogation in the traditional sense, not a confrontation designed to break a confession out of silence, but something stranger and in many ways more disturbing. A conversation with a man who does not need to be broken. A man who offers himself to the process with a composure that makes every person in the room quietly reassess their understanding of what evil looks like. Journalist Domingos Miralles spent over a year negotiating access to Leandro before securing the interview that would air on Camera Records' flagship investigative program. The negotiation itself is notable. Not many imprisoned killers require a year of persuasion. But Leandro had learned, even inside the walls of his incarceration, that his story was a commodity, and commodities have leverage. He understood that people wanted to see him, wanted to understand him, wanted to press their faces against the glass of his psychology and look for the seams. He rationed that access accordingly. When Miralles finally sat across from him, he brought photographs. Crime scene photographs. Images of the women Leandro had killed. The actual faces, the actual places, the documented aftermath of what he had done. He laid them out one by one, a deliberate and calculated technique designed to provoke a reaction, to find the fracture in the composed surface. Leandro looked at them, and when confronted with DNA evidence placing him at crime scenes, biological proof, forensic certainty, the kind of evidence that dissolves every possible deniability, he offered two words. Neo se, I don't know. Not denial, not explanation, not even the performance of confusion. Just two words, delivered with the flat certainty of a man who understood that the evidence existed and had made peace with not acknowledging it. He was confronted, and he did not express so much as a flicker of discomfort. Criminal psychologists who assessed Leandro for the court created a profile that the presiding judge, Maria Gabriela Riscali Tejera, incorporated into her sentencing language. She described him in her written ruling as a true serial killer, a phrase that carries specific clinical weight in the Brazilian legal system, capable of attacking and brutally killing people he does not even know, simply because he deems them unworthy of living. That phrase, unworthy of living, is the psychological core of everything Leandro did. He had appointed himself an arbiter, a judge of female worthiness, a man whose personal damage had calcified into a theology of contempt so complete that it justified, in his own internal logic, the erasure of women he had never spoken to, never wronged him, never existed in his world beyond the moment he decided they were forfeit. Prosecutors used another framing. The perpetrator is a serial killer who harbors a feeling of revenge against women. Revenge. Not random violence. Not impulse. Revenge. A word that implies a perceived debt. A ledger of wrongs that exists only in the mind of the man keeping it, but feels entirely real to him. His mother's infidelity, her survival, his girlfriend's departure. Every woman who had, in his distorted accounting, diminished him or left him or refused to be what he needed her to be. They all bled together into a single figure, a composite target, and every woman he strangled in a dark alley in Guarulhos was, in the theater of his psychology, that same figure being punished for the same offense. This is not sympathy. This is forensic understanding. The distinction matters because without it, the crimes seem random, seem like a chaos that could not be predicted or profiled or stopped. With it, a horrifying coherence emerges. Leandro Basilio Rodriguez was not arbitrary. He was systematic, and that makes him, in some ways, more frightening than the killer who simply explodes. His preferred victims shared a consistent physical profile. Slight, short, thin. The prosecutor noted this explicitly. He chose them because their size made his actions easier, because he is a physically strong young man. He was calculating risk in real time, the way a carpenter calculates load-bearing weight or a financier calculates exposure. He reduced the variable of resistance to its lowest possible value before he acted. He maximized certainty. He operated with the cold efficiency of someone who had thought about this a great deal and refined his process through experience. The use of drugs, both his own consumption and the drugs he offered victims as lure, layered complexity onto the profile. Leandro was himself a heavy user, and his arrest came on a night when he was so deeply intoxicated that he could barely navigate a city street. Yet his crimes, when examined forensically, show none of the chaotic imprecision of drug-addled violence. They show control, planning, selection, which suggests that Leandro Basilio Rodriguez, whatever the drugs did to his body, carried the architecture of his crimes in a part of his mind that the substances could not reach. A cold compartment that remained operational regardless of his chemical state. The glasses, again. Investigators and journalists who encountered him in person consistently noted the detail. Clear lenses, no prescription, worn with deliberate consistency. Psychological evaluators flagged this as evidence of a need to perform authority, to signal that he occupied a different cognitive plane than those around him. He was not a man who stumbled into violence and was consumed by it. He was a man who constructed an identity around it, who wanted to be perceived as its architect rather than its prisoner. Even after capture, even facing sentences that stretched his imprisonment into lifetimes, he maintained this posture. He was, in his own estimation, exceptional, too clever to be truly caught, too superior to be truly understood. And yet, in the interview with Meyerless, cracks appeared, not in his composure, but in his account. He denied the majority of the murders he had originally confessed to in custody. The 50 women became, in his revised testimony, a much smaller number. He confirmed 2 killings, one of them a crime he said he had committed as a teenager, a murder that had never been discovered, a body somewhere that no family had ever been able to identify and reclaim. He described shooting a woman twice, hiding the body, burning it. He spoke of it with the same emotional register one might use to describe a forgotten errand. Then he retreated behind his trademark deflection. I don't know. His legal proceedings unfolded over years. Brazil's court system is not swift, and a case involving multiple victims, multiple jurisdictions, and contested evidence across dozens of crimes required extensive litigation. He was initially convicted in 2012 on charges related to one victim, receiving 25 years. Then in 2015, a jury trial found him guilty of 4 additional murders: Kilian Leite da Silva, Vivian da Silva Correa, Juliana Teixeira do Nascimento, and Aline Senna de Rocha, adding over 111 years to his sentence. Further proceedings addressed Giselle Cabral de Souza separately. The accumulated total of his sentences eventually surpassed 150 years. An almost theatrical figure that reflects the Brazilian legal system's desire to register the magnitude of the crimes even within a framework that caps actual imprisonment at 30 years. He would serve 30 years at most under Brazilian law. He had been incarcerated since 2008. The mathematics of justice are sometimes brutal in their inadequacy. Throughout the legal process, families of victims endured the particular torture of watching a man who had taken everything from them perform composure in courtrooms, deflect evidence with practiced calm, and treat the proceedings as a stage rather than a reckoning. One of the most painful moments reported by observers of the trial was the reaction of Leandro to the photographs and testimony presented. Not anger, not remorse, but a kind of detached observation, as if he were watching a documentary about someone else's crimes and found it mildly interesting. The women he killed had families who went to work every day after the verdict, who lit candles, who carried the weight of an absence that never becomes lighter, only more familiar. Kilian's 2 children grew up without their mother. Vivian's loved ones counted the years. Juliana's family, who had a student, a young woman building a future, received instead a file number and a cause of death and the name of the man responsible, sitting behind glass in a suit, wearing glasses he did not need. What the psychological evaluators ultimately concluded was this: Leandro Basilio Rodriguez was not insane. He was not delusional. He understood the nature of his actions, understood their illegality, and chose them anyway with full cognitive clarity. He was diagnosed with characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder, a cold capacity for manipulation, a total absence of empathy, a habitual pattern of lying without discomfort, and a deep structural inability to feel the reality of other people's pain. He was not a man who did not know what he was doing. He was a man who knew exactly what he was doing and believed he had the right to do it. That is not madness. That is something far harder to explain, and far harder to forgive. By the time the Guarulhos court handed down its final consolidated judgment, the case of Leandro Basilio Rodriguez had stretched across 8 years of legal proceedings, multiple jury trials, revised sentence totals, and the exhausting, grinding machinery of a justice system processing a crime that defied easy categorization. He had been 19 at the time of his arrest. A teenager, technically, though the word feels obscene when applied to what he had done. Brazil's legal system grappled with this fact in his early proceedings. He had committed some of his first confirmed crimes as a minor, which under Brazilian law required initial processing through the juvenile justice framework. He was sent, at some point in his early history, to a youth detention facility from which he escaped. He returned to his mother's home, and he continued killing. That escape and return is one of the most haunting footnotes in the entire case. Here was a young man who had already been identified by the system as dangerous, already documented, already placed in a facility designed to intervene, and the intervention failed. The facility's walls were not enough. The system's reach was not long enough. And so he went back to Guarulhos, went back to his neighborhood, and the women of that city continued to live under a threat that had, for a brief moment, been close to contained. How many died in the window between his escape and his final arrest? The honest answer is that no one knows with certainty. Leandro's own testimony from the night of his arrest, those 50 women, was never conclusively verified or conclusively disproved. Investigators were able to confirm specific murders through forensic evidence, witness accounts, and his own admissions in controlled settings. The confirmed count, depending on the jurisdiction and the evidentiary standard applied, sits between 5 and 9. The suspected count, based on the geographic spread of his confessions and the pattern of unsolved murders in Belo Horizonte, Rio de Janeiro, and Sao Paulo, could be significantly higher. Some investigators who worked the case believed that the true number would never be known, that victims existed whose cases had been closed, attributed to other causes or other perpetrators, whose connection to Leandro would remain permanently unprovable. The case forced Guarulhos, and Brazil more broadly, into an uncomfortable confrontation with how quickly a serial predator can operate in urban spaces when the victims are from vulnerable communities. Kilian was a drug user. Vivian had been found in an alley. Juliana in a trailer near a highway. Aileen's body discovered on the same day as his arrest, found and processed as another crime statistic before investigators understood it was linked to a man they had in custody. Each of these women existed in the margins of public visibility, in spaces where absence takes longer to register, where the machinery of missing persons investigation grinds more slowly because the social infrastructure supporting those investigations is thinner. This is not a criticism of the investigators who worked the case, many of whom pursued it with dedication and eventually built the evidentiary case that put Leandro behind bars. It is an observation about the structural reality that serial predators exploit. Leandro Basilio Rodriguez understood, at some level, that his victim's circumstances reduced the immediate investigative pressure he would face. He was not choosing them only for their physical size. He was choosing them for their invisibility, for the time their deaths would buy him, and the families left behind, the children of Kilian, the relatives of Vivian, the parents of Juliana, the loved ones of Aline and Giselle, lived with a grief that the sentencing numbers could not address. 157 years. 111 years. Numbers that the media repeated and that provided a kind of narrative satisfaction. Justice served, number large, monster contained. While the actual reality for survivors was far more complicated. Leandro was capped, by law, at 30 years of actual imprisonment. He had entered custody in 2008, which meant that the mathematics of the Brazilian Penal Code, however well-intentioned, made possible a future in which the man who took Kilian's life while she was pregnant with her third child could one day walk out into sunlight. That possibility sat in every family's stomach like a stone. The interview with Meyerless, broadcast years after the arrest, reopened wounds. Families who had tried to build distance from the events, tried to set the case inside the past where it could not reach them daily, were confronted again with the image of the man who destroyed them, composed on camera, performing the role of someone thoughtful and reflective. He denied crimes. He admitted to. He claimed selective memory. He looked at photographs of the women he had killed and said, "I don't know," as if the forensic evidence were a rumor someone had started about him, and not the biological trace of his presence inside the crime scenes where their daughters and sisters and mothers were found. 3 families agreed to speak to Meyerless for the broadcast. 3 families opened their doors to a camera and tried to translate the shape of a loss that had no adequate vocabulary. What does a mother say about the night she was told her daughter had been found in an alley, violated and discarded? What language covers that? The interviews were brief, by any standard. Grief that big does not expand to fill an hour of television. Compresses. It becomes a single sentence, a single photograph held up to the camera, a name said aloud one more time in public so that the story does not belong only to the man who caused it. The criminal psychology community in Brazil used the case as a reference point in the years that followed, not because Leandro was the most prolific Brazilian serial killer, but because his age, his trajectory, and the compression of his violence into a relatively short span made him a useful case study in what accelerated development of predatory behavior looks like. The markers were, in retrospect, present throughout his childhood. The unstable home, the absent emotional regulation, the early criminality, the pattern of abandonment transformed into grievance, the vow made at 13 that was kept with terrible consistency through his entire adolescence and into his first years of adulthood. None of those markers, by themselves, produced a killer. Countless people survive terrible childhoods without becoming predators. But in Leandro, the combination found no counterweight, no intervention that held, no relationship that redirected him, no consequence that arrived early enough to interrupt the formation of his killing methodology before it solidified. By the time the system finally touched him in any meaningful way, the architecture was complete. He had built himself into what he intended to be, from the night at 13 when he stood over his bleeding mother and decided she should not have survived. He was, experts concluded, exactly what he wanted to be, and that, more than the death toll, more than the sentence, more than the composite sketch that finally put an officer in his path, is what makes the case of Leandro Basilio Rodriguez so deeply, persistently disturbing. The randomness of evil is terrifying, but it is also, in a paradoxical way, slightly comforting because it implies chaos, implies the absence of agency, implies that the universe produced something monstrous without intention. The deliberateness of Leandro is the opposite of comfort. It implies that a person can look at the damage done to them and choose, can build something from that damage, piece by piece, victim by victim, can wear glasses they do not need and drive through the streets of a sleeping city and select the next name that will never be spoken without grief. Guarulhos has grown quieter about the case in recent years. Cities do what cities must. They absorb their horrors and continue. The international airport still routes millions of passengers each year through that city. The neighborhoods where bodies were found have been lived in by new families, painted over, rebuilt in small ways. The alleys are the same alleys, the parking lots the same parking lots, but the particular weight of those specific dates and names does not press on daily life in the way it once did. But in some homes, the weight has never lifted. In some homes, there are photographs on walls. Young women, frozen in the particular way that photographs of the dead become more precious and more unbearable with each passing year. Women who were 23, who were students, who were walking somewhere on a September night or a May night or an August night and encountered a 19-year-old boy who had decided, years before he met them, that they did not deserve to continue. In some homes, the sentence total of over 150 years is just a number that still does not feel like enough. That will never feel like enough because no number can be enough when what was taken cannot be counted in years, cannot be returned, cannot be sentenced back into existence. Leandro Basilio Rodriguez sits in a closed-regime prison somewhere in São Paulo state. He wears, presumably, whatever the institution provides. The glasses, with their empty lenses and their performance of superiority, are part of a life that belonged to the streets of Guarulhos in the dark years of 2007 and 2008. The streets are still there. The dark still comes. And the names Kilian, Vivian, Juliana, Aline, Giselle, the names remain permanent in the record, belonging now not to the man who ended them, but to the families who carry them forward. That carrying is the only justice that operates without a cap. The only sentence without a release date. That carrying does not end. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third and final story. Story 3. The crime case of Louise B.A., a.k.a. the monster of Arakim, the butcher of the southern fields. He walked out of prison, and children stopped coming home. Before the devil had a face in the southern farmlands of Brazil, he had a name that mothers whispered and children were warned never to speak near the dark, and his name was Luiz Bao. Picture a man so disturbingly ordinary that prison guards handed him the keys to a garden and called him a model inmate. A man who smiled quietly, tended crops with patient hands, shared the vegetables he grew with officers who trusted him completely, and bowed his head in prayer at night like any God-fearing man of the southern fields. A man whose calm was so convincing, so perfectly sustained, that the system around him slowly loosened its grip and gave him freedoms no convicted child killer should ever have been extended. Now picture that same man dissolving into the Brazilian interior on a January afternoon in 1980 barefoot, backpack slung across his broad shoulders, moving through dense rural terrain with the unhurried confidence of someone who has walked this land his entire life. Picture law enforcement finding out he was gone and doing absolutely nothing about it for 23 full days. No emergency broadcast, no community warning, no mobilization of any kind. Just silence, stretching across the farms and villages of Rio Grande do Sul, while a predator moved through the trees. And by the time that silence broke, by the time the newspapers screamed and the police scrambled and the mothers pulled their children inside, for more people were already in the ground. 3 of them were young boys. Their bodies bore injuries so deliberately grotesque, so impossibly cruel, that the forensic doctors who examined them had to pause mid-report and collect themselves. When officers finally cornered Bao on a highway, it took 40 gunshots, a neck graze, a knife wound, and a hand-to-hand brawl before he went down. The crowd that gathered outside police headquarters that same day numbered 500, and they were not there to celebrate the arrest. They were there to demand a lynching. This is not folklore. This is not the kind of story that gets exaggerated across generations until the truth is buried beneath mythology. Every detail in what you are about to hear is documented, verified, and preserved in police records, autopsy reports, and court proceedings that still exist in the archives of the Brazilian South. This is the true, complete, and deeply disturbing case of Luiz Bao, known to history as the monster of Arakim. A man who was caught twice and escaped twice, whose final location has never been confirmed, and whose name, more than 4 decades later, still makes the older residents of Arakim lower their voices when they say it. There is a particular kind of evil that does not announce itself with noise or chaos or the kind of visible instability that triggers alarm in the people around it. It does not arrive wearing a grotesque mask or muttering incoherently on street corners. It does not leave a trail of broken relationships or obvious warning signs that, in retrospect, seem almost too clear to have been missed. Instead, it settles quietly into a community like weather, like something that simply arrives, takes up its place in the landscape, and appears to belong there. It works hard. It earns trust through physical labor and practical usefulness. It smiles at the right moments, maintains the right silences, offers its hands when help is needed, and waits. It waits with a patience that has nothing peaceful about it. That was Luiz Bao. That is the most important thing to understand before a single crime is described, before a single body is found, Before a single headline is printed, the man was patient. He was quiet. He was trusted. And he was far more dangerous than anyone around him ever permitted themselves to believe until it was far too late to matter. Louise Bao was born on June 21, 1939, in the rural district of Sitlagoas, a small and largely unremarkable stretch of agricultural land within the municipality of Itatiba do Sul, located in the southernmost Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul. He entered the world in poverty, the child of farmers named Florindo and Vittoria, and he was shaped from the very beginning by the rhythms and demands of rural labor. The land was where he learned everything. The fields gave him his identity, and more dangerously, they gave him his body. From adolescence onward, Louise Bao was known throughout his community as a man of extraordinary physical strength. The kind of man you wanted when there was heavy work to be done, land to be cleared, livestock to be managed, crops to be hauled in before the rains came. He was reliable in the way tools are reliable. You picked him up when you needed something done, and he delivered. He also cultivated a secondary reputation as a curandero, a folk medicine man, which in rural southern Brazil carried a particular kind of social weight. He used herbs and teas, offered blessings, provided treatments for common ailments. People came to him. They trusted him with their bodies and their children's bodies. That role, the healer, the wise man of the fields, the trusted elder with his remedies and his calloused hands, was not incidental to what Louise Bao eventually became. It was, in the most direct and damning sense, the tool he used to access his first victim. He lived in Itatiba do Sul until his late 20s, and during that time, the family structure around him began to fracture. After the deaths of his parents, a ferocious dispute erupted between Louise and his brother João over who would inherit and manage the family property. These arguments were not polite disagreements between grieving men. They escalated with the kind of intensity that only long-contained resentment can produce, until one day the conflict crossed into physical violence. João struck Louise with a hammer. Most men, struck in such a confrontation, respond with fists or retreat. Louise Bao responded with a shotgun. He aimed at his brother and fired 3 times. All 3 shots connected. João survived, but he spent the rest of his life carrying the permanent damage of that encounter in his scarred eye, his ruined arm, his wounded leg. What this moment revealed was something that would define Louise Bao's entire existence. When faced with losing something he believed was his, when confronted with the possibility of being left behind or discarded, he did not reason, did not negotiate, did not retreat. He reached for maximum violence and delivered it without hesitation. Following this encounter, Bao left Itatiba do Sul and drifted northward to Chapico, in the neighboring state of Santa Catarina, where he took work on his uncle Julio's farm and began the slow process of constructing a new version of himself, or rather, laying a fresh surface over the old one. He met a female farmhand named Nilda Pinto de Quadrush, and the two were married on October 7, 1967. For several years, the life of Louise Bao looked almost ordinary. He worked the fields. He maintained a household. He existed within the recognizable structures of rural life, and nothing about him from the outside suggested that he was anything other than what he appeared to be, a hard-working, somewhat quiet man trying to build something in the southern interior. The stability crumbled from within, as it always does with men like Bao. By 1972, reports surfaced of assaults and thefts, and his marriage to Nilda descended into instability and then ended entirely. The circumstances surrounding the collapse of that marriage carried a detail that would take on enormous psychological significance in the context of everything that followed. It is believed that during this period, Louise Bao contracted mumps and, as a consequence, became sterile. For a man whose entire identity was rooted in physical dominance, rural masculine strength, and the sense of ownership that defined his relationship to everything and everyone around him, the news of sterility represented a kind of annihilation. Something fundamental was taken from him, or rather, something he had believed was fundamental to who he was ceased to exist. Nilda divorced him not long afterward. Whatever internal architecture had kept Louise Bao functioning within the margins of ordinary social behavior had now lost one of its few remaining structural supports. He drifted again. In the winter of 1974, Bao arrived in a rural settlement called Linha Jubair, back within the municipality of Atadaba du Sul, returning, essentially, to the territory of his origins, but now as a broken, middle-aged man with no wife, no children, no property, a history of violence, and a rage that had nowhere left to discharge itself except inward or outward. He was taken in by a widow named Maria Zarpalin, a woman of remarkable endurance, raising 17 children alone and constantly in need of reliable labor. She had heard of Bao's reputation as a capable farmhand, and she offered him shelter and work. He accepted. He moved into the household, and almost immediately, with the patience of a man who had learned to wait, he began studying the family around him. Among Maria's 17 children was a boy named Francisco. He was 12 years old when Bao arrived in that household, the couple's 12th child, a boy who had suffered from asthma since childhood and had been receiving treatment for most of his young life. He was therefore uniquely accessible to Bao's secondary identity, the folk healer, the man with herbs and remedies. Bao positioned himself as Francisco's treatment provider, and under that cover, began spending time with the boy that slowly, methodically, crossed every boundary that should have been uncrossable. He took Francisco into the woods. They spent hours there together, alone, and returned only after dark. The community began to notice. The local schoolteacher noticed. The parish minister noticed. Both confronted Bao about the nature of his relationship with the child. Bao's response in those conversations was not defensive or embarrassed. It was possessive. He spoke about Francisco in terms that communicated ownership, as though the boy belonged to him, as though the teacher and the minister were interfering with something that was rightfully his. That possessiveness itself was a flashing signal that should have ended Bao's presence in that household immediately. Instead, it generated weeks of community discussion and hand-wringing while the situation continued. Francisco's older brother returned from military service and observed the dynamic with the blunt clarity that comes from being slightly outside it. His concerns were specific and urgent. The family held serious discussions. A decision was made. Francisco would be sent to a Catholic seminary in the city of Garibaldi, far enough away to break whatever grip Bao had established over the boy. Distance was the answer. Send him to study. Send him toward God and learning and a future that had nothing to do with this man and these woods and this arrangement that had poisoned the air of their household. When Bao was informed of this decision, something shifted visibly in his demeanor. He told those around him that he would also be leaving, and that before he went, he wished to leave behind some of his wages for Francisco. Money for the boy to spend at his leisure, a farewell gift. He framed it with warmth. He framed it as generosity. What it actually was, what it was recognized to be only in the catastrophic aftermath, was a manipulation designed to create a final private encounter with a child he refused to relinquish. On February 26, 1975, Francisco's mother sent him on a routine errand: ride to the nearby mill and bring back cornmeal. The boy set off on horseback. He was seen stopping at a relative's house along the way. He was seen at a local grocery store. He was normal, present, alive. A boy running an errand on a summer afternoon in the countryside, returning home through familiar roads. And then the road swallowed him. The horse arrived home alone that evening, trotting into the yard with blood on its harness and no rider on its back. The community scattered. The search was immediate and desperate, driven by the terrified instinct that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Bao was questioned. He denied everything. He said he had not seen Francisco, knew nothing of his whereabouts, offered nothing. But the grocery store owner had seen them together that very afternoon, a detail that landed on the search effort like an accelerant on flame. 2 days of searching passed. 2 days of increasingly frantic, increasingly grief-soaked searching, before a discovery was made in the garden of the local chapel. A body, wrapped in bean sackcloth, buried just below the surface of the earth. It was Francisco. He had been 13 years old. The autopsy report that followed his death is documented history, preserved in the criminal proceedings of the case, and it describes injuries of such deliberate and grotesque brutality that the word savage does not come close to adequately containing them. Francisco had been lured into the woods under the pretense of a farewell conversation. He had been sexually violated. His throat had been cut with a pocket knife. Deep, methodical slashes across his neck and into his left side that drained the life from him while he was still on the ground. And then, after death, Bao had mutilated the child's body in a manner so specific, so calculated, so ferociously intentional that forensic specialists described it as bearing the hallmark of someone who felt not remorse but rage. The rage of a man who believed the boy had tried to leave him, and who punished that imagined betrayal with every act of violence his hands could devise. The location of the body, buried in the chapel garden, was not random. Bao had placed it there to cast suspicion on the minister he blamed for the decision to send Francisco to the seminary. He had planned the placement. He had wrapped the body and carried it to that spot and buried it with deliberate care. This was not impulsive. This was constructed. The regional press responded with collective horror. A Voz de Serra ran the headline "A Beast in a Tadaba" on March 6, 1975. Zero Hora placed it on the cover. Papers across Rio Grande do Sul carried the story. Bao was arrested the following day, February 27th, while the search for Francisco's body was still being formally concluded. He was tricked, and the system, having labeled him, evaluated him, sentenced him, and watched him behave with extraordinary cooperative calm inside its walls, prepared to release, or, more accurately, how willingly it had allowed itself to be deceived, because the signs of who he truly was had never fully disappeared. They had simply been buried beneath the performance of a man who understood, with an almost clinical precision, exactly what those around him needed to see in order to feel safe. Bao knew what a rehabilitated prisoner looked like. He knew the behaviors that earned trust, the gestures that communicated transformation, the demeanor that made guards relax and supervisors reduce their vigilance. He studied those around him the way he had studied the boy in the widow's household, patiently, observantly, adjusting his behavior in real time to produce the responses he needed. And the system gave him everything he was working toward. Inside the Arakim State Prison, Bao was assigned to garden duties. He tended the vegetable plot with a devotion and care that observers found genuinely impressive. He grew produce consistently and in quantity. And then, in a detail that requires a moment's pause to fully absorb, he shared that produce with the guards, with the officers, with the law enforcement personnel responsible for keeping him confined. He handed vegetables to the men whose only job was to ensure that he never walked free again, and they accepted them because what does a man who hands you fresh vegetables look like? He looks like someone who has found peace. He looks like someone who is grateful, cooperative, invested in the community of the place where he lives. He looks like rehabilitation in its most tangible form. He was allowed to move freely throughout the prison. He was characterized as a man of exceptional calm. He was trusted. There was one moment, a single crack in the facade, that, in retrospect, deserved far more serious attention than it received. During a visitation period, when Bao encountered the relatives of another imprisoned man, he quietly and clearly threatened to burn down that man's house. The comment reached the Linha Jubair community and generated several months of unease. But within the prison's operational framework, it changed nothing about how Bao was treated or what freedoms he was permitted. The garden continued. The vegetables continued. The trust continued. The system needed him to be what he appeared to be, and it chose to let one threatening comment slide rather than reassess the entire picture. Because of his model prisoner status, Bao was eventually granted extraordinary privileges that bear repeating clearly, because they are so difficult to understand in hindsight. He was permitted to work at a penal colony in the Freinape neighborhood, roughly 10 kilometers from the Arakim State Prison. Beyond that, he was also permitted to work on a private farm in the Aeroporto district, 8 full kilometers from the prison, owned by a man named Aparicio Amancio Bueno, 65 years old. Bueno had developed a genuine fondness for Bao during their time working together. He had reportedly complained, openly and sympathetically, about the way prison guards treated Bao, feeling that the man was misunderstood or dealt with unfairly. There was an affection there, the kind of real human connection that made the later events particularly devastating to process. And this arrangement, This private farm, 8 kilometers from the prison, where a convicted child killer worked largely unsupervised in the company of a trusting elderly man, was considered perfectly appropriate by the authorities overseeing Bau's incarceration. On January 20th, 1980, Louis Bao was working on that farm. Around noon, he put down whatever he was doing and walked away. Not dramatically, not in a sprint through a broken fence with sirens behind him. He simply disappeared into the landscape, the same landscape he had known since childhood, the fields and forest margins of southern Rio Grande do Sul, and no one raised an alarm. 23 days passed. 23 days during which the escape of a diagnosed schizophrenic convicted of one of the most disturbing child murders in the region's history generated no emergency response, no public warning, no communication to neighboring municipalities, no advisory to rural schools or community centers. 23 days during which Louis Bao moved through the countryside freely, confirmed later to have passed through communities in Araquim, Garama, Orea, and Gachulio Vargas, covering ground, studying his surroundings, and preparing himself for what came next. On February 9th, he was spotted near Povoado Argenta in Araquim, a barefoot man with a backpack on a rural path. No one thought to report it because no one had been told there was anything to report. When local and state media finally broke the story of his escape, the reaction from the communities of the surrounding region was instantaneous and visceral. Parents locked gates. Schools sent notes home. The fear that had been locked away for 5 years, filed under the heading of handled, resolved, contained, came flooding back with the specific intensity of something that had never truly gone away, only been suppressed. Because in the rural interior of Rio Grande do Sul, the memory of Francisco's death had not faded with time. It had settled into the bedrock of community consciousness, the way stories of genuine local horror always do, becoming part of how parents explain the world to their children, part of the vocabulary of danger. And now the thing behind that story was loose. There is a detail in the reconstruction of Bau's movements between his escape and his first post-escape murder that deserves particular attention, because it illuminates something important about the nature of his planning. Among the items found on his person when he was eventually recaptured were a wig of long brown hair attached to a green mesh screen, identity documents, and an electoral title belonging to someone else entirely, and military-grade clothing consisting of olive-colored jackets consistent with those worn by the military brigade or the National Army. None of these items materialized from thin air. The wig was manufactured. The documents were stolen or obtained through a contact. The military clothing had to come from somewhere specific. Investigators at the time raised serious questions about whether Bao had received assistance from someone within the prison system, someone who had helped him prepare for a prolonged period of life outside the walls. The disguises, the false identity, the weapons he later acquired, all of it pointed toward preparation rather than impulse. He had not snapped and bolted. He had waited until his preparations were complete, and then he had walked away. He had also, crucially, familiarized himself with every community within walking distance of the places he intended to operate. He knew the Rio Toldo area. He knew the Rio Tigre settlements. He knew the Aeroporto district farm because he had worked there for years. He knew where children walked alone and at what hours. He knew which fields had enough cover to conceal what he intended to do. He had been moving through these communities as a trusted, authorized worker for months before his escape, building a mental map of opportunity with the calm diligence of someone who intended to use it. And when February came and the communities around Araquim still had not been warned, and the children were still doing what children in rural Brazil do, running errands, herding cattle, walking to the store in the afternoon light, Louis Bao was ready. The Araquim police, the civil police of Paso Fundo, the military brigade of Rio Grande do Sul, the public security secretariat of the state, and the military firefighters corps would all eventually be deployed in the hunt for him. Hundreds of officers, full-time pursuit operations, resources drawn from multiple agencies across the state. And for 32 days after the first of his 4 post-escape murders, all of those resources chased a barefoot man through cornfields and eucalyptus stands without catching him, because the man they were hunting had spent his entire life in exactly that kind of terrain, and because they were already too late to save the people who needed saving most. What the silence of those 23 days cost. measured not in institutional failure or procedural criticism but in the lives of specific people, in the grief of specific families, in the terror of a specific 11-year-old boy who ran for his life and barely survived, is the true indictment at the center of this case. Not Bauer's schizophrenia, not the inadequacy of psychiatric resources in 1970s Brazil, not the limited forensic capabilities of the era. The indictment is the silence. The 23 days of institutional indifference during which everyone responsible for the safety of those communities chose, consciously or negligently, to do nothing, and for people paid for that choice with everything they had. February 12, 1980, Rio Toldo Community, Araquim, Rio Grande do Sul. Late afternoon, the kind of heavy summer warmth that settles over the Brazilian south in mid-February and turns everything golden and slow and deceptively peaceful. 12-year-old Jander Cardoso left his family's home with a simple task: walk to the nearby community warehouse and buy candles and matches. It was the kind of errand that required no supervision, generated no anxiety, and fit naturally into the rhythms of a rural household where children were expected to contribute and capable of running basic errands without being accompanied. Jander went. He reached the warehouse. The owner saw him, served him, took his money, and watched him leave with his purchase tucked under his arm. And that was the last time any living person who survived would report seeing Jander Cardoso. When the boy failed to return home, his family began the familiar sequence: the calling of his name, the checking of the obvious routes, the growing discomfort that tips from inconvenience into alarm. They went to the warehouse themselves and confirmed that yes, he had been there, had bought what he came for, had left. No one had seen him after he walked out the door. The community organized a search. Lanterns came out as the light faded, and people spread across the fields and trails around Rio Toldo, pushing into the corn stands and the tree margins, calling for a 12-year-old boy who was not answering. The following afternoon, February 13th, residents searching in a cornfield stopped walking. Blood was dripping from the corn husks. Slow, dark drops falling from the leaves and pooling at the base of the stalks, already darkening in the heat. Following the source, they found disturbed earth beneath the corn. The body of Jander Cardoso was there, buried face down in a hole dug with crude urgency, a machete abandoned in the grass a short distance away. He had been buried hastily but deliberately, the way someone buries something they want temporarily concealed rather than permanently hidden, the way someone buries something they expect others to find. The autopsy conducted at the Hospital de Caridade de Araquim documented what had been done to Jander with the clinical precision that forensic medicine demands and that the human imagination struggles to process without recoiling. His anal sphincter had been ruptured. His genitalia had been completely amputated. The injuries were not random. They were not the result of a frenzied, uncontrolled attack that escalated beyond what the attacker intended. They were methodical. They were intentional. They were the same injuries in the same configuration, produced by the same specific acts that had been inflicted on Francisco in 1975. The forensic signature was so unmistakable that investigators did not deliberate long before issuing their conclusion. This was Luiz Bao. This was the monster of Araquim, operating exactly as he had operated 5 years earlier, in the same region, against the same category of victim, with the same calculated savagery that had horrified the state the first time. The Araquim police issued a formal order for Bauer's capture within hours of the autopsy results being confirmed. But issuing an order and executing one are different things entirely. By the time officers were mobilized and beginning to organize their response, Bao had already moved. He was no longer in Rio Toldo. He had picked up his backpack and walked south into the next community, deeper into the maze of rural settlements that surrounded Araquim. Territory he knew intimately, territory where he could move without drawing attention because he looked like what he had always looked like. A working man traveling on foot in the fields. Rio Tigre, February 15, 1980. 2 children, both 8 years old. Gelson Ribeiro and Paulo Grando had been given a task by their parents. A neighbor's cattle needed to be herded out to graze and returned before evening. It was a 2-boy job in a community where children regularly managed livestock. A responsibility that taught them independence and practical skill, and that was in no way considered dangerous. The grazing land around Rio Tigre was open and familiar, Fields bordered by stands of eucalyptus and pine, dotted with the kind of shaded areas where cattle naturally congregated in the afternoon heat, and where children who spent their days in those fields knew every tree and every trail. Gelson and Paolo went out with the cattle. They did not come home. By nightfall, the alarm had been raised. 20 families from the surrounding area joined the search, spreading out across the grazing land with everything that could produce light, moving through the eucalyptus stands and along the cattle trails, calling the boys names into the dark. The search ran through the entire night. At dawn on February 16th, Gelson's mother found her son and Paolo near a stand of eucalyptus trees, a patch of shade near a spot where the boys had regularly brought cattle to feed, a place so ordinary and familiar that it should have been the last place on earth where something like this could happen. Both boys were dead. 8 years, identical injuries to those inflicted on Jander 4 days earlier, identical to those inflicted on Francisco 5 years before that. The method did not vary. The deliberateness did not vary. The specific, monstrous finishing act that Luis Bao imposed on every victim he took did not vary. It was a signature written in the bodies of children, and it was unmistakable. The city of Arakim did not process these deaths the way a community processes an ordinary tragedy. With grief that is deep but bounded, pain that is real but eventually metabolized. What descended on the city and the surrounding rural areas was something different and far harder to describe. A collective, sustained terror that altered the behavior of an entire population. Parents stopped sending children to school. Women who had walked rural roads alone their entire lives stopped doing so. The fields and forests and paths that had defined the daily texture of life in this region. The routes children took to run errands, the grazing land where boys herded cattle, the forest margins where young people had wandered freely for generations, were suddenly understood to be something else entirely. They were hunting grounds. They had been all along, and no one had known it until the blood made it impossible to pretend otherwise. On February 17th, Bao arrived in Povoado Argenta. There was a boy there, 11 years old, named Lindomir Truilia. Bao approached him with the same focused, deliberate manner he brought to every selection, the unhurried attention of a man who had decided and was simply executing his decision. Lindomir did not know who this barefoot man with the backpack was. He did not have a name to attach to the feeling that rose immediately in him when that attention landed on him. But the feeling itself, the cold, sharp, animal certainty that something was wrong, moved his feet before his mind had finished processing the situation. He ran. He ran into a nearby pottery workshop where his father was working, and his father's immediate, visible presence was enough to send Bao retreating without completing what he had come to do. Lindomir survived because his instincts were faster than his fear, because his father happened to be within reach, and because fortune, on that particular afternoon, decided to distribute itself differently than it had to Jander and Gelson and Paolo. When investigators showed the boy a photograph later, he identified Luis Bao without hesitation. The same man, the one who had looked at him in that specific way and begun moving toward him. The one who had only stopped because a father was standing in the doorway. That same evening, Bao made a journey that was, in its own way, the most psychologically revealing movement of his entire rampage. He walked to the Aeroporto district, to the prison farm where he had worked for years, to the home of Aparicio Amancio Bueno, 65 years old, the farmer who had been kind to him, who had complained about how the guards treated him, who had extended warmth and sympathy and the kind of human regard that Bao had apparently accepted without any reciprocal feeling whatsoever. Bueno was there when Bao arrived. The two men encountered each other that night, and whatever passed between them, whatever words or silence or recognition crossed the space between a trusting old farmer and the killer he had once sheltered and fed, ended the same way everything ended when Luis Bao felt that something was his to take. Bao drew his knife and cut Bueno's throat. He then moved through the farm with systematic calm. He collected clothing. He took food. He retrieved the 32-gauge shotgun, sawed off its barrel. He loaded his .22 caliber revolver. He gathered cartridges and packed everything into his bag. He took the wig. He put on the military jackets. He walked out into the night fully equipped, fully armed and completely without hesitation. The same way he had walked out of the prison farm a month earlier, the same way he had moved through every community and every encounter in the weeks between. 4 victims confirmed dead, a 5th narrowly escaped, a city paralyzed, and Louise Bao moving through the darkness toward whatever came next. The 32-day manhunt that followed was one of the largest coordinated law enforcement operations in the modern history of Rio Grande do Sul. The military brigade of the state, the civil police of Arakim and Paso Fundo, the Public Security Secretariat, and the Military Firefighters Corps all deployed resources simultaneously, running full-time pursuit operations across an area that covered multiple municipalities and hundreds of square kilometers of rural terrain. Officers followed confirmed sightings, chased false leads, responded to phone tips that placed Bao in 2 different locations at the same time. He was reported barefoot in the rain, carrying his bag along back roads. He was reported resting near the Natsari waterfall, in uninhabited land outside the city. He was reported in disguise, using the wig and the false identity documents to pass through areas where officers were searching for a man matching his description. Reports suggested he may have had an accomplice inside the prison system, someone who had facilitated his preparation, supplied the disguises, and helped him plan for an extended period of evasion. None of this was ever definitively resolved. The city lived in a state of sustained, grinding terror for those 32 days. Every morning that passed without news of his capture was another morning in which parents kept their children indoors, in which the fields sat empty of the workers and children who had always populated them, in which the ordinary social life of rural communities contracted down to the minimum necessary for survival. The monster of Arakim had done something that even his 5 murders could not fully accomplish on their own. He had stolen the sense of safety that an entire region had spent decades building, and he had done it simply by existing and being free and being impossible to find. February 21st, 1980. A highway, a grocery store at the side of the BR-153, one of Brazil's great inland routes cutting through the sprawling rural south. The tip came through civilian channels, ordinary people, residents of the area who had seen the newspaper coverage, who had seen the photographs, who recognized the barefoot man in the military jacket standing at the side of the road with a bag over his shoulder. They called the military brigade. The brigade dispatched a 7-man team. When the officers arrived at the location that had been called in, they found Louise Bao standing outside the grocery store, eating food he had purchased there. Not hiding, not sprinting, not crouched in a ditch with a weapon already raised. Standing in the open, eating, with the unhurried ease of a man who had been moving through open country for over a month and had learned to trust his own ability to disappear whenever disappearing became necessary. Then the officers announced themselves, and Bao ran. What followed over the next several minutes is one of the most extraordinary sequences documented in any Brazilian criminal arrest of that era. The 7-man team opened fire. By the officer's own documented account, approximately 40 shots were fired in Bao's direction as he moved through the roadside brush, changing direction, using the vegetation, putting obstacles between himself and the people shooting at him. 40 shots. Not 2 or 3 fired in the confusion of a sudden pursuit. 40 rounds deliberately aimed at a running man in a relatively open area, by a team of trained officers, under conditions that should have made him impossible to miss. And not a single bullet struck him. He kept moving. He was still alive. He was still free. It was the chief of police, Alcer Borden, who changed the equation. Rather than continuing to fire from the front alongside his team, Borden moved laterally, circling through the forest at the side of the road, working his way around the pursuit to come at Bao from behind. He closed the distance quietly and fired 5 shots of his own. For missed. The 5th grazed the side of Bao's neck. Not a clean hit, not a wound that dropped him or significantly impaired his movement, but enough to break his momentum and shift the geometry of the confrontation. For a fraction of a second, Bao's focus redirected. Borden's revolver ran out of ammunition at exactly that moment. 6 shots total and now empty, in the hands of a police chief standing very close to a man who had just killed 4 people in 4 days. Bao turned with the knife. He drove it into Borden's thigh with the same decisive force he had applied to every act of violence in his life. Fully committed, without hesitation, without the flinching that affects most men in a desperate physical confrontation. Borden went down to one knee. What happened next was documented in the aftermath as simply as it could be. The two men fought on the ground, officer against killer, and Borden won. He struck Bao in the head with enough concentrated force to drive him down and keep him there until the backup team could arrive and restrain him physically. When officers searched Louis Bao at the moment of his arrest, the inventory of what they found on his person read like an artifact from a world operating by its own logic. 4,000 cruzeros in cash, a stolen identity card and electoral title belonging to a different man, someone whose identity Bao had apparently claimed as a backup persona. The wig, long brown hair, attached to a thin green mesh screen, designed to be worn over his own head and fundamentally alter his profile. A nickel-plated .22 caliber revolver. A 30-centimeter knife with a wooden handle, still in its leather sheath. The sawn-off 32-gauge shotgun with a cartridge still loaded in the barrel, its stock broken, its barrel cut down for concealment. Military jackets in olive green. Candles, some whole, some already used. Cartridges for multiple calibers. A gas lighter. A volcano-style bag in greenish black. And 6 photographs. 5 of women and 1 of a boy. That last detail. A single photograph of a boy, carried on his person through the murders, through the manhunt, through the chase and the fight and the arrest, was noticed by every investigator who reviewed the inventory and never adequately explained by any of them. It was simply documented and allowed to sit in the record, asking its own unanswerable question about what it meant and who it was and where Bao's mind went when he looked at it. The city of Arakim erupted. A Voz de Serra reported on February 23 that approximately 500 residents had gathered outside the military brigade's headquarters, converging from the surrounding neighborhoods and rural communities, filling the street in front of the building with a pressure and a fury that the officers inside could feel through the walls. They were not there to welcome the news of an arrest. They were not there to thank the police for their work. They were there demanding, loudly, explicitly, in terms that left no interpretive ambiguity, that Louis Bao be removed from the building and handed to the crowd. Correo do Povo documented the chants from that crowd. Murderer. Does not deserve to live. We want a lynching. These were not the spontaneous expressions of individuals who had simply heard news of an arrest. They were the organized, sustained, collective voice of a community that had spent 5 years living with the memory of what Bao had done to Francisco, and 32 days living inside the active terror of what he was doing again, and that had arrived at the calculation that no judicial process could be trusted to produce an outcome proportionate to what they had endured. The military brigade did not release him to the crowd. Bao was transferred immediately to the Forensic Psychiatric Institute Mauricio Cardoso in Porto Alegre, transported under heavy guard and with the kind of urgency that reflected an institutional awareness that his physical safety could not be guaranteed if he remained in Arakim. At the institute, he was placed under heightened security protocols. No detailed public records exist of his behavior during the 5 months he spent there between his February capture and his June escape. A silence in the documentary record that, in retrospect, feels significant, because investigators later concluded that those 5 months were not spent in quiet compliance or in the passive, disoriented suffering of a man broken by capture. They were spent planning. On June 30th, 1980, the padlock securing the courtyard of the Forensic Psychiatric Institute Mauricio Cardoso failed. Whether it was forced or picked, or simply inadequate to the sustained attention of a man who had decided that leaving was his next task, the record does not specify. What it specifies is the result. The padlock burst open, and 5 inmates exited through the courtyard into the Porto Alegre night. 4 of those men were recaptured within a short period. 1 was found sitting in a tree on a city street, eating bananas, apparently having reached the limits of his escape plan somewhere between the Institute's courtyard and civilization. The 5th man was Louis Bao. He was not found in a tree. He was not found on a street. He was not found at any border crossing, in any neighboring town, in any rural community, on any road in any direction. He was simply not found. He had walked into the darkness of the Brazilian night and disappeared with a completeness that suggested he had known exactly where he was going and had known it for months. The next morning, July 1st, 1980, a Voz de Serra ran a front-page headline in enormous black type, "Cuidado, Luis Bau. Careful, Louise B.A. The sentence trailing off into white space that communicated dread more effectively than any complete statement could have. Rural schools in Porto Alegre closed their doors. Communities that had spent the spring trying to return to normalcy, trying to file the terror of February back under the heading of the past, found that the past had refused to stay filed. The fear came back hard and immediate and with no clear end point, because this time there had been no capture, no highway confrontation, no brawling police chief with a final shot. There was only the empty space where Louise Bao had been, and the horizon he had walked toward, and the knowledge that he was out there again. This time he stayed out there. The theories about what became of Louise Bao after June 30th, 1980, are numerous and none of them conclusive. The one that carried the most institutional weight, the one discussed in corridors if not in official documents, was that Bao had been quietly eliminated by security agents near Lake Guaiba. Given the severity of his crimes, the ferocity of the public response to his first recapture, the impossibility of guaranteeing his security in any facility that might hold him, and the near certainty that a second recapture would trigger another 500 people outside another police headquarters demanding the same outcome as the first time. Given all of that, certain individuals in positions of authority may have decided that a different kind of resolution was both simpler and more final. This theory has never been confirmed. It has never been formally denied. It exists in the historical record of this case as an acknowledged possibility that no one has been willing to either prove or close. Other theories sent Bao north into the agricultural interior of Parana, where he could exist under a stolen name in communities that had no particular reason to scrutinize a quiet, strong farmhand looking for work. Others looked south and west across the borders into Uruguay and Paraguay, countries with limited extradition infrastructure, large agricultural populations, and border zones that in 1980 were considerably easier to cross without documentation than they would become in later decades. Bao had a false identity card. He had cash. He knew how to work with his hands and how to earn trust from farmers who needed reliable labor. He had done it before. He could do it again, anywhere the past had not already followed him. The Brazilian justice system, unable to locate him, proceeded without him. His trial was scheduled for March 26, 1984. He did not appear. The criminal court of the District of Arakim conducted the proceedings in his absence, reaching verdicts against a man who was not present to hear them. A formal arrest warrant was issued on April 3, 1985. Under the applicable Brazilian law of that era, the statute of limitations on his crimes eventually ran out in 2005. 25 years after his second escape, the government, completing its accounting with the families of his victims, awarded each family a sum of 3,900 Brazilian reals, 3,900 reis, for a child buried face down in a cornfield, for two 8-year-olds found side by side beneath eucalyptus trees, for a 13-year-old boy whose death was so horrific that the newspaper that first covered it searched for words adequate to the horror and ultimately settled on beast. 3,900 reis, and a formal acknowledgement that the system had failed in every measurable way, offered in the only currency the state had left to offer. Louise Bao, born June 21, 1939, has never been confirmed dead. He has never been apprehended. He was tried in his absence and convicted in his absence, and an arrest warrant bearing his name sat in the files of the criminal court of the District of Arakim for decades. If he survived into old age, he would be in his mid-80s today, somewhere, in some form, carrying in whatever remains of a mind fractured by schizophrenia and shaped by violence the memory of what he did in the fields of southern Brazil. 5 confirmed murders. The mutilation of every victim in a pattern so specific and so calculated that it bore the unmistakable stamp of deliberate ritual rather than uncontrolled rage. 2 escapes from custody. A 32-day manhunt that deployed multiple state agencies and failed to catch a barefoot man with a bag on his back. A crowd of 500 people who came to a police station and asked for justice by a different name and were denied it. And then, finally, a second disappearance so complete that not even the full resources of the Brazilian state have been able to account for it in the 45 years since it happened. In Arakim, the name still carries weight. The older residents speak it the way you speak the name of something that left a permanent mark, not with distance, not with the detached interest of people describing someone else's history, but with the specific tension of people who remember what it felt like to live inside that story. The schools that closed, the fields that emptied, the parents who checked doors and checked windows and lay awake doing the arithmetic of whether their children were safe, knowing they did not have a reliable answer. The monster of Arakim left no closure behind, no grave to mark, no courtroom resolution to stand as a monument to justice, no confirmed end, only the open question of a man who walked into the dark and was never definitively found. And the knowledge that some stories do not end cleanly, do not tie themselves into shapes that the human need for resolution can accept, but simply stop mid-sentence, like a headline that trails off into white space and leaves the worst of the fear to your imagination. Some doors, once open, stay that way. And somewhere, in whatever direction the monster of Arakim walked on the night of June 30th, 1980, there is a road that has never answered back. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.